Hi guys, today we're going to go through a PowerPoint about the novel Night. Since you did your first reading, it's time for us to take a look at the reading and really analyze what's happening in the book so that you can begin your next reading. This is one of my first recorded PowerPoints, so please bear with me as I go through the presentation. But hopefully at the end of this, we can look at the question of why Ellie chose to begin his story at a point before World War II, or before the Germans had taken over Hungary in World War II. So let's begin looking at the background of the story. So as we look at the background, we need to start with the narrator. We see that Ellie is a 12-year-old boy. He's living in Transylvania, which is a town in Saigot, Hungary. He doesn't actually live in Germany. And this is important for us to remember as we move on with our story, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Ellie is the son of a Jewish man that lives in Hungary, and he's a well-respected shopkeeper. Ellie is the only son, which is also important as we move on in our story, and we'll talk about later in the novel. But he has 3 sisters, and the sisters become important to Ellie's development and his life. So Ellie has 2 older sisters, Hilda and Bee, and 1 younger sister. If we look at this slide, you can see a map which shows where Ellie lives. So as we start to look at this and see where Ellie lives, we see that Ellie lives over here in Saigot, and Saigot is in Transylvania, which is part of Hungary. You may know Transylvania from the famous story Dracula, but Hungary is not in Germany. In fact, Germany is 2 countries over, all the way over here to the left. It is separated, Hungary and Germany are separated by Austria. So during World War II, the Germans invaded Austria, came through Austria, and then invaded Hungary, eventually reaching Ellie's town. Just for reference, Romania is below Hungary, and the Russian Empire would be above this. And this is really where our story begins and takes place. A lot happens in the 4 years from where the story begins to when the Germans invade. So we're looking at the story's exposition, which, if you remember from last year, is the story's background. We see in the very beginning that Ellie, this 12-year-old boy, decides that he's going to study Jewish law and Jewish religion called the Kabbalah. This is a picture on the left of what the book the Kabbalah would look like. This is unusual for somebody 12 years old, and Ellie's father is really against him studying religion, but allows him to meet up with a man named Moshe the Beadle. So Moshe the Beadle is a local pauper. He's really poor, and he's not born in Hungary, so he's considered a foreign Jew. Which just means that he's not a born citizen of Hungary, and they considered anyone not born there to be foreigners, even though they had been living there for a long time. So, after about 4 years or so, Moshe is taken and put in a cattle car and deported because he was not a Hungarian-born Jewish person. When Germany invades, they go all the way across Transylvania to Ellie's town, and they decide to start to deport anyone who is foreign-born. And the Hungarian government that is now taken over by Germany allows this to happen. So Moshe the Beadle is put in a cattle car, and he is taken all the way out of Hungary, which we'll see in a minute, where he is forced to dig his own grave. Luckily for Ellie, he escapes and comes back and tries to tell his story. However, people do not believe his story. And this is kind of where the questioning of why people did not believe his story and what could people have done about this had they believed his story really begins for the Jewish people in Hungary, and Ellie explores that question in the rest of his book, along with other questions. So, let's start in 1944, which is about 3 to 4 years after Ellie begins his training in 1941. The Hungarian government falls. Germany comes in and takes over, and the Germans soon move into Szeged. Ellie has never seen this before, and he's experiencing it for the first time, as well as his father, his family, all of the other Jewish people who had been living there peacefully. At first, they think that the laws maybe aren't so bad. They come in and they arrest the community leaders, but the Jewish people feel that's part of war and that the leaders will eventually be let free. They also confiscate the Jewish valuables, which they say will be used in the war effort. And all the Jewish people are forced to wear yellow stars on their shirt so that they can be easily identified. Eventually, later, they're moved to the ghettos, and that's where the next part of your story will start today, and we'll actually be talking about that. But it's important to note that the Jewish people thought these laws were annoying, but that they would pass, and after a while, and after the war, that things would go back to normal. Wearing yellow stars, having some of their valuables taken, having their community leaders arrested as long as they were returned was not such a big deal. If we look at this next slide, like I said, this is where the question begins. One of the biggest questions of the Holocaust is whether or not the Jewish people could have prevented it. So, if they would have acted more wisely, if they would have made different choices, would it have been preventable, or would it have happened anyway? And Ellie wants to take a look at this in his memoir. What could we have done different if we could have done anything different? And what happens as a result of my people, meaning Ellie's people, not taking action? So, Ellie takes this book and he relates that to what's happening to him and all of the other Jewish people. And he makes a really important point here. He says throughout his story, and we'll take a look at this in a minute in the writing, that the Jewish people never truly believed that they would be killed by Hitler. They never believed that his plan was to kill them. They simply believed that his plan was to take over, maybe take some things and even some things out. But in the end, that God would save them and that they would be fine. By the way, on the right-hand side is an actual picture of Jewish deportees getting into cattle cars to leave and go to concentration camps, which as we start to progress in our novel, we're going to see this would also be what happened to Moesha the And Moesha the beetle, or Moshe the beetle, is where we're going to start our analysis of this memoir. We're really going to start to look at the writing. Ellie starts his story with Moshe the beetle because Moshe should be the warning sign to the people in his town. However, as we see, he's not going to be. So he begins with one simple sentence. They called him Mushi the Beetle, as though he had never had a surname in his life, which means a last name. So Moshi is just Moshi the Beetle with a nickname. And why he's poor, and most poor people are not respected, Ellie makes it clear from the beginning that Moshi the Beetle is the exception to that. He's very respected in the town. He says Moshi the Beetle was the exception. Nobody ever felt embarrassed by him. Nobody ever felt encumbered by his presence. He was a past master in the art of making himself insignificant. So he wasn't overly important, but people respected him as a person. By the way, the picture back there was a picture of Moshi the Beetle. He goes on then to tell the story after a while of what happens to Moshi 4 years after he begins his training. He says one day they expelled all the foreign Jews from Sagat, and Moshi the Beetle was a foreigner. So he gets on this cattle car, he's sent away. And a long time passes. So after all these people who are foreign-born Jewish people in Hungary are sent away, life seems to go back to normal. In fact, Ali talks about this. He says the deportees were soon forgotten. And he goes on to say several days passed, several weeks, several months. Life had returned to normal. A wind of calmness and reassurance blew through our houses. The traders were doing good business. The students lived buried in their books. And then most importantly, the children played in the streets. When you see an image of children playing in the streets and people going about their daily lives, you know that things seemed normal. And this is how it was for the Jewish people in Hungary. Yes, they took away the foreign-born Jewish people, but for the rest of the Jewish people in Hungary, their valuables were gone, but life started to return to normal. They had to wear a yellow star, but they could do everything they wanted. They could go in the playgrounds. They could cook their meals. They could live their lives the way they wanted. They could even attend school. As the story progresses, he begins to talk about what happens to Moshi the Beetle. And Moshi the Beetle escapes and comes back. And he begins to tell his story to the Jewish people. And it's a pretty horrific story. This part of the book is put in there for two reasons. One, to show us as the reader how horrific this event was. And number two, to also show us that it was almost unbelievable to the Hungarians that were Jewish in this town. He says the Jews were made to get out. They were made to dig a huge grave. And when they had finished their work, the Gestapo began theirs with passion, without haste. They slaughtered their prisoners. Each one had to go up to the hole and, if you hit the next slide, present his neck. So right here, they were killed. Okay? They had to actually pick up their necks, and we don't know if they were shot or stabbed. It sounds like they were probably stabbed, and they fell into graves that they had just dug. The worst part of the story, I think, or the most profound part of the story, is the very next line, when he says, babies were thrown into the air, and the machine gunners used them as targets. This is almost unthinkable. The fact that they would throw babies in the air and shoot them like they were clay pigeons, target practice. But it actually happened. And when Moshi the Beetle comes back and he tells this story, people can't believe this. They didn't see it for themselves. And they're saying, you're crazy. This never happened. No one would do this. Ellie ends his story by saying people refused not only to believe his story, but even to listen to him. They didn't even want to listen to a story that was that horrific. The pictures on the side here, just to show you, if we were looking, down here is Hungary. So down here is where Ellie and Moshe lived, and they were taken all the way by train up out of Hungary into what is between Ukraine and Poland, and that would have been the forest where they had to dig their own graves. So he had a long journey back, Moshe the Beetle, to get back to his people across a lot of land, but he does make it back. Over here is a picture of the mass graves in that forest. So when the people were shot, later they went and put stones and marked the graves. So how does this all happen? They don't believe him. It's almost too much to believe. But why, when they start to see this happen, would they not, meaning the Jewish people, would they not stand up? And would they let the Gestapo and the Germans come in and just keep making new laws? In order to understand this, we need to look at the words of Ellie's father in the book. And we're going to look at one passage that kind of sums it up. On the right-hand side, this is a picture of Ellie's father, a real picture. So while he's an older man, he's not real old in the book. But he believes he's this respected Jewish owner, and he believes that he's going to be taken care of. He believes in his religion. In fact, at one point, Ellie comes to him and says, "Dad, we should move and escape and move to Palestine. Let's just get out of here." And then this is what his father's answer is to him. He says, "Ellie, man raises himself toward God by the questions he asked him." He was fond of repeating that is the true dialogue. Man questions God and God answers, but we don't understand his answers. We can't understand them because they come from the depths of the soul and they stay there until death. You will find true answers, Eliezer, only within yourself. Right there, when we look at that, the very first part of that, man questions God and God answers, but we don't understand his answers. Ellie's father is telling him your beliefs are your most important thing. And God pretty much has a plan according to his father. And that's what they believed. That there was always a plan for us. And sometimes we don't understand the plan. And you need to look into yourself and just keep up your own strength. But right now, this is what we have to go through because it's God's plan and we are going to be stronger in the end. Ellie's father's belief here is meant to be or show you the belief of the Jewish people. When Ellie writes this, that's what the message he's trying to convey. And here we start to see part of the theme of the story. The Jewish people have so much faith that they believe that they're going to be saved and that they are going through all their misery because it's God's plan. They are very faithful people, and Ellie wants to convey that message just as much as he wanted to convey the message with Moshe the Beetle, that the things that they're talking about are so horrible that people didn't even want to listen because they didn't want to hear such horrible things. The first part of the story that you read conveys both of these messages as well as shows what normal life was like and why it was changing slightly. It hadn't become as horrific as Moshe was explaining. As we progress in the novel, we're going to see what happens. So at this point, the Jewish people feel, we can handle this. It's okay. And when we start our story today, they're going to get moved to the ghettos. And we're going to see what happens as they move to the ghettos and still ask the same question. What could we have done? Should we have done something different? So, as you finish this PowerPoint, you're going to go and answer the questions about the PowerPoint, and then we're going to read a little bit today. You're going to answer your questions like you did the other day, which the other day should have, if you remember all the way back before Easter, should have did revolve around this whole idea of what is going on, what was life like, and how could we have changed, or what could Ellie and his family have done differently. So we're going to move on from that today and ask more questions about how life changes again and what is done differently. Good luck with the questions. Come back to this PowerPoint if you need to.